So I'd like to welcome everyone to the joint meeting of the City Council and Planning Board. It's a remote meeting on Wednesday, March 9, 2022. This is an informational presentation on the Department of Housing and Community Development draft MBTA community guidelines. In the interest of government transparency with regards to deliberations and decisions made by the City Council and according to open meeting law, since this meeting was posted as a Zoom meeting, this meeting is recorded by video and audio and will be conducted by remote participation. Additionally, all votes taken by the City Council during this and future remote meetings will be made by roll call vote. At this point in time, I'd like to officially call the meeting to order of the City Council and introduce members of the council, and then I'll turn the meeting over to Rick Noonan, who will do the same with the Planning Board. Councilor Grow, present. Councilor Frank Majota, present. Councilor Scott Memhard, present.
Good to be here. See you all.
Sean Nolan will be coming a little bit later, I believe, so he's not here right now. Councilor O'Hara is not able to make it tonight.
He's on.
No, I'm here.
Oh,
O'Hara's
right.
present.
okay, great, because you just told me you weren't coming, so I'm glad you're here.
No. I said I didn't get to read the homework. I apologize. I've been working since 6 o'clock this morning.
Okay, all right, terrific. Thank you. Councilor O'Neill?
Here.
Councilor Worthley?
Evening.
Councilor Gross?
Hello.
So 8 members of the City Council of Gloucester is here on the call. So I'd like to turn the meeting over to Rick Noonan now on the Planning Board to do the same.
So I'd like to call the Planning Board meeting to order. We don't have exactly a quorum, but my name is Rick Noonan. I'm the Planning Board Chair. We have Sean Henry, Beverly Bookin, and of course, our Planning Director, Greg Catamatori. If any further members join the call, we will be identifying them as they join. I just want to thank the Mayor, the City Council, and certainly the members of the Planning Board to avail themselves of this informational session. This is, again, going to be another long exercise on how to comply with the guidelines that the state's put forward. And, you know, as always, any public input is greatly appreciated. So I'll turn it back to the Council President, Gilman.
Great, thank you, Rick. And also, we're grateful that Mayor Greg Verger is here today and our city clerk, Joanne Sinos. So at this point in time, the first order of business tonight is to ask our mayor to speak on behalf of the city, just to kind of kick this off. He has an important meeting that he has to go to with the school committee. And we'd love you to kick this off, Greg and Mayor Verger, and thank you for being here. So you have the floor.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank the planning board members and the city council for all the hard work they've done with the 9 amendments that have come across, and now the hard work you're about to undertake with this MBTA plan. And just to be clear, the steps we have, this is from on high. This is not a city generated plan or guidelines. It's very coincidental and very unfortunately coincidental that 6 of our 9 amendments sort of relate to what the state is pushing. That's why we've sort of put those on the back burner. That being said, Greg's going to present shortly and talk about how we got where we are through the state. And we are taking the steps. I've been assured that the city, filling out the checklist as the first requirement to the state does not lock us into anything. I will repeat that. Filling out the checklist does not lock us into anything. One of the following steps is this meeting we're having now, which is a presentation to the public. And then what will happen next is we'll take in the feedback that has been coming in through my office, and we will present on behalf of the city. I will present something to the state. And I just want to be 100% clear that I have no intention of locking the city into anything until the state has finalized the rules and regulations for this MBTA concept. right now, these are draft form regulations, and I don't think anybody in their right mind would sign on to a blank check like that. So I think we all need to keep an open mind. We're elected to represent people, but that part of that is being open-minded and listening to what is going to be presented today and what the state finally does send down our way. But that's the key. Until we have the final regulations, this mayor is not signing off on anything. So with that introduction, I'll turn it over to Greg, who is going to fill you into the best of his ability with what we have so far from the state. I'll stay on. I have to get to a school committee meeting at 6:30. I'm going to shut my camera off, but stay listening until then. But thank you, everybody, and good night.
Great, thank you, Mayor. And we're so happy that the Assistant Community Development Director, Greg Catamatori, is going to lead the next part of the meeting, which is giving us the information that we need to know, starting with the state's information. So the floor is yours, Greg, and thank you for being here.
Sure. Thank you, Greg Catamatori, Interim Planning. Oh, geez, gotta keep track of the title. Planning Director, Interim Community Development Director. Thought a lot about this. We've had a bit of time to prepare for this meeting, given that this information has been provided in a lot of different ways from the state over the last couple of months, mostly through presentations by Secretary Mike Keneally of the Executive Office of Housing and Economic Development. And as Mayor Verga pointed out, this is a state initiative. This is a state law that was passed last year, and draft regulations that have been created by a state agency to basically define how municipalities that are under this jurisdiction have to comply. So I was prepared to utilize the resources that the state have provided. It was decided that maybe more appropriately for folks, particularly members of the public that may not have had access to some of the presentations made by the state, to essentially play one of those presentations. It runs about 30 minutes. It will give you all of the background information as to the genesis of the legislation, as well as what these draft guidelines look like and what they mean for communities and the timelines associated with them. So I'm going to attempt, this should work, and if there's any problems with the audio, I have a couple of people that will let me know, to play a presentation that is put on by Mike Keneally that was presented on January 12th. It also includes other staff members from the Department of Housing and Community Development, which are the ones that are generating these guidelines. So no better way than to hear directly from the state. And as the mayor has pointed out, this is not a local initiative. We are being asked to comply with the state regulation and state law. And so I'm going to give that a whirl, and it'll run again for about 30 minutes, and then we can pick up after that. So if that's okay with you, Council President and Chairman Noonan, I'm going to share my screen, and hopefully the audio will come through without any hitches.
Terrific, thank you. And I just want to announce we have 42 attendees right now.
52.
52. Okay.
Good afternoon, everybody. I want to thank you all for joining us here today for this webinar. I'll note up top, we have about 800 people joining us today, and it's great to see so much interest and engagement in this important topic. I'm Mike Keneally. I'm the Commonwealth Secretary of Housing and Economic Development. I'm joined by a few fellow presenters here today from our Department of Housing and Community Development, Undersecretary Jennifer Maddox and Chris Kletchman, and also joined by Clark Ziegler from Mass Housing Partnership. We hope this is going to be an informative webinar. I'll also point people towards our mass.gov Mbta Communities website, which has a lot more information about this topic, including the draft guidelines, a form for communities to fill out this year, as well as a form to submit comments and questions on the draft guidelines, and a frequently asked questions document that we uploaded, I believe, last night. So there's a lot on the mass.gov Mbta Communities website, and encourage you to take a look at that. I'll note as well that during the webinar today, you can submit questions using the Zoom Q&A feature, and our team is going to review all the questions that come in, and that will help inform us as we draft the next iteration of our frequently asked questions document. I do want to as well thank and acknowledge the members of the legislature here with us today. And as always, thank and acknowledge their important partnership in this work. So by way of background, it was a year ago this week that Governor Baker signed an omnibus economic development package into law. And it included a number of things. Notably, it included the housing choice zoning reforms, which have enabled our communities to adopt certain zoning measures to promote housing by a simple majority vote versus the simple supermajority vote that existed before. We continue to be encouraged, by the way, about how that's being adopted around the state by local leadership using this tool to approve housing supportive zoning measures. And that same bill also included this new multifamily zoning requirement for Mbta communities. And that, of course, is the topic we're going to talk about today. And I'll note as well as we go through this deck, we'll make this deck available on the website so folks can consult it afterwards. Let's go to the first slide. You know, for us, any discussion about housing starts with our level of housing production in the state. And as you can see here, from 1960 to 1990, Massachusetts permitted about 900,000 housing units. From 1990 till today, a similar almost 30-year period of time, it's been about half that. And so in a single generation, when our economy has grown, our workforce has grown, our population has grown, our level of housing production has been cut in half. We estimate today we're short by about 200,000 housing units. And if we go to the next slide, this describes what we talk about, the housing crisis. I always say we don't use the term housing crisis lightly, but we do use it often. That's where we are in Massachusetts. We're in a housing crisis. We faced a core challenge now for some time to create adequate housing to support our young families, our workers, and our seniors. I'll note that we believe the pandemic has only made these trends worse. And there's a lot of metrics we track in terms of our housing markets today in the Commonwealth. We look at home values and rents, which today are among the highest and fastest growing in the country. We look at the degree to which our households are deemed to be cost burdened by housing. If you're paying more than 30% of your income in housing, you're cost burdened. That's about half of our households today. We look at vacancy rates for home ownership and rental properties. You know, a stable market for home ownership is about a 2% vacancy. For rental properties, it's about 6%. We're at about half those numbers today. So we got some real challenges in housing. It's an incredible burden on our families and households all around the state. I'll note as well, one of the great joys of my job is traveling all over Massachusetts and engaging with our municipal leaders, our community leaders. And I constantly hear everywhere in the state about the desire for our local leaders to produce more housing, to create the kind of communities they want to create. And finally, the other dimension of the housing crisis is our ability to compete economically. In addition to housing, I oversee everything we do around economic development and trying to grow jobs in Massachusetts. This is a competitive disadvantage for us. Again, having very high housing costs relative to other states hurts us in terms of our ability to create and retain jobs. I note as well that some of our states that we consider to be competitors in the innovation economy and other key sectors, places like Charlotte and Phoenix and Houston, on a per capita basis today, those places are producing about 3 times the amount of housing we're producing. So this housing crisis has a number of different dimensions that are impacting our households, impacting our communities, and impacting our ability to compete economically long term. Let's go to the next slide. You know, confronting the housing crisis has been a top priority of the Baker administration since its earliest days. I'll note here a few things that we've done to try to address the housing crisis. First, in 2018, the governor signed the largest housing bond bill in state history, authorizing more than $1.8 billion for affordable housing production and preservation. Since 2015, we've invested $1.4 billion into the affordable housing ecosystem, producing about 22,000 housing units. There are a number of other programs. Our MassWorks program, which I know a number of folks are probably familiar with, that's generated another 21,000 housing units. Our Commonwealth Builder program, producing properties for affordable home ownership. Many other programs. We've thrown a lot of different resources to this to simply create a lot more housing. In the economic development bill I mentioned, the housing choice zoning reforms we think are critically important. There's also a number of capital programs in there to create more transit-oriented housing, money for neighborhood stabilization to return blighted or vacant units back into productive use, and money for climate-resilient affordable housing production. In recent months, the ARPA spending package signed by the governor has more money for housing production. And I'll note as well the Eviction Diversion Initiative, a really terrifically important program run by Jennifer and team at DHCD, to keep families housed during the pandemic. So we've done so much that we believe government can and should do to really address our housing crisis, but we simply need to produce a lot more housing all across the state. Next. I always say that our housing strategy could probably be simply summarized as more types of housing everywhere. And so we need affordable housing, workforce housing, market rate housing, literally everywhere in Massachusetts, from the Berkshires to the Cape. But I will note that transit-oriented housing development, I think, holds a special role in our strategy going forward. We have to continue to leverage housing best practices to meet the state's housing needs to position us best for the future. I think this is a tremendous opportunity for us. You know, Clark and team have done the analysis on the degree to which we have a lot of transit-oriented housing today, and it's not that much. The analysis they did was looking at our transit stops around Massachusetts and literally counting up all the housing units within a half-mile radius of those transit stops, and concluded there's about 6 homes per acre near public transit. I think that's pretty darn low. If we simply got that 6 up to 10 units per acre, that's another 250,000 housing units that would be produced. So this is a big opportunity for us. And I'll note as well the importance of transit-oriented housing. You know, this is simply good housing policy, good climate policy, good transit policy, and good local economic development policy. To have more housing near the places we go to every day, to have better access to work and services and other destinations by increasing mobility of our citizens, by increasing utilization of public transit, getting cars off the road, promoting equity and fair housing by providing more choice, more diversity for housing options. I think this is a really important effort and initiative, and these guidelines, we hope, will further these objectives. Next. So what are we talking about today? Well, I'll note that when the governor signed the multifamily zoning requirement into law last January, he made it clear that our administration would take a thoughtful approach to developing the guidelines in accordance with the new law. And we believe we've done that. We've had a lot of discussions over the last year with a variety of stakeholders to inform our draft guidelines. The guidelines came out on December 15th, as you probably saw. We had an interagency work group consisting of folks in my office, from DHCD, from MassDOT, Mass Housing Partnership, Mass Development, and others. Worked very closely with Clark and his team at MHP's Center for Housing Data. So it's been a robust process here internally within the administration and engaging with a number of stakeholders. I'll note a few things about the guidelines. First, they do not take a one-size-fits-all approach. You know, we have a great diversity of different MBTA communities. We recognize that multifamily districts that may be reasonable in one city or town may not be reasonable in another. The draft guidelines propose that a district of, quote, reasonable size will be determined in part by the type of public transit in those communities. We do believe these promote equity and fair housing, very important considerations as we solve our housing crisis. I'll note as well that these guidelines, this law, is all about zoning, simply the rules that can be, the rules that establish what can be built and where, not with regard to permitting individual projects or the production of housing itself. And so importantly, these guidelines do not have a production mandate. They have nothing to do, for example, with 40B, but they really kind of level the playing field, set the playing field rather, to let communities determine where these zones ought to be, and over the long term, over the medium term, create the kind of housing they need for their communities. Next. Before I turn it over to Chris and Clark, I'll just note that this is the relevant section from the Economic Development Bill, and you can see in here a couple things. So this is the kind of the entirety of the statute that is we've worked off of to develop our guidelines. But it says an MBTA community will have a zoning ordinance or bylaw that provides for at least one district of reasonable size where multifamily housing is permitted as a right. It's got to be housing without age restrictions and suitable for families and children. The zone has to have a minimum gross density of 15 units per acre, and where applicable, located not more than half a mile from public transit. For communities that don't comply with that, they're not eligible for certain of our funds, notably the Housing Choice Initiative and the Local Capital Projects Fund and the MassWorks Infrastructure Program. And we are charged per the statute to develop the guidelines, and that's what we issued on December 15th, draft guidelines in that regard. And if we go to the next slide, this is, I think, a helpful map on the part of the state we're talking about today. Where are these MBTA communities located? And I'll note as well that an MBTA community is defined in statute. There's 175 of those communities. And that's what we're talking about today. I think with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chris and then Clark, and then I'll be back later in the presentation. Then we'll hear from Jennifer at the end. But thank you all again for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Secretary Keneally, and thank you for your leadership on this important initiative. I'm going to talk about some of the details in the draft guidelines and just start off by reminding folks that soon after Governor Baker signed the legislation, we put out preliminary guidance that let everybody know that during last year's grant rounds that everybody would be considered in compliance until more detailed compliance was established. And now we're here to talk about the draft guidelines. One of the most important policy things that we're charged with is to determine what reasonable size was. And we have a two-part test in the guidelines. First, there's a minimum land area, and that is 50 acres of land. And that's just, it's a pretty common sense number. It's only a tenth of, if you do a whole radius around of a half mile around a transit station, that's just 1/10 of that. And so as you look at 50 acres on the ground, and as we talk about later in the slides, we think this is an achievable for all the communities that are covered. And it's important, as the Secretary noted, we have to have a minimum gross density of 15 units an acre, subject to limitations that may exist in the state environmental code. The second part of the reasonable size test is a minimum multifamily unit capacity. And I'm going to spend a little bit of time here on this chart just to make sure folks understand how we approach this. As the Secretary mentioned, we feel that for equity reasons and for access to transit, it is important to note that the higher your level of transit, the higher the requirement is to have a certain capacity in your zoning district. So we've established 4 service categories. They're shown on the left in blue in this chart, and that is subway or light rail, MBTA bus communities, commuter rail communities, and adjacent communities that don't have any specific transit service or transit facility from the MBTA. And I should note that communities are categorized in these communities if they have land within their municipality that has one of these facilities, or if there's land within a half mile of their community. And so, for example, if your community has a subway station within a half mile, but it's actually in another municipality, you would be categorized as a subway community. The middle column here is the percentage, and the percentage of the total housing stock that's required. And the total housing stock number that we're using is the 2020 census, the redistricting numbers. And the highest requirement is for subway and light rail communities at 25%, at bus communities at 20%, commuter rail communities at 15%, and adjacent communities at 10%. The last chart, the last column on this chart just gives you the distribution of the communities that we have. Rory, let's go to the next slide. So I'm a map person, and this really helps bring home why this is very common sense. As you can see here, the subway communities are dark blue, bus communities lighter blue, commuter rail, you can see those linear lines outlined in green, and the adjacent communities in light green. And as you can see, the closer you are to inner core Boston and surrounding, the higher the requirements are for your multifamily housing capacity. This map is also on the website that the Secretary mentioned, mass.gov/MBTA communities. So if you ever have a question, you can refer to that chart there. Next. So let me just go through how this will work kind of on the ground, because there's the minimum land area, which is 50 acres, but there's also the capacity to have a certain number of multifamily housing units. And so let's just go through some examples. Let's say we have municipalities with a nice round number of 10,000 housing units. And here this just goes through how that would play out for that kind of municipality. If that municipality was a subway community, their minimum capacity for multifamily housing would be 2,500 units. MBTA bus communities, 2,000 units, commuter rail, 1,500, and adjacent 1,000. And I just want to be really clear here. We're talking about setting the table with zoning that allows multifamily by right, And we're asking communities to calculate the capacity that that zoning district would have. We're not asking folks to permit housing. We're not measuring production of housing. And we understand that actual unit production will depend on many, many factors. So we're talking here about setting the table and measuring what could happen. Next. So, like I said, reasonable size is one of the main policy features that we spend a lot of time thinking about, and are articulated in the draft guidelines. They have to have a certain size of 50 acres and a gross density. So the unit capacity is the number of multifamily units that could be built as a percentage of their housing stock. The gross density comes into play because 15 units times 50 acres is 750 units. And so one of the things for communities that have fewer than 7,500 units, or smaller communities that are MBTA communities, actually have a floor of 750 units. So regardless of if your community has 5,000 units and the straight math, and let's say you were an adjacent community and the straight math of the 10% would give you 500 units, because of the minimum land area and the minimum density, the floor for all communities is at least 750 units. And so we're trying to explain this. We've had some questions about that. And so this is trying to tell you why that 750 is the minimum number of unit capacity for all communities. Next. So we also, in addition to the reasonable size, location is very important. And so if you have a qualifying transit facility in your municipality, or if a municipality has that, then the guidelines require that at least half of the multifamily district be within a half mile of the transit station. The guidelines have lots of detail about this, but I want to highlight that we're not talking about measuring like from the a pin set in the center of a station. The guidelines articulate that the measurement of a half mile within a transit station is actually from the area of the parcel in which the transit station. So if there's a station and its area and its parking, we're measuring from the outside of that those parcel boundaries. So we're not really talking about circles, we're talking about more common sense parcel distribution. But anyway, half of the multifamily zoning district has to be within a half mile of transit stations. That's if you have a transit station in your municipality. For communities that don't have any transit station or are not within a half a mile of a transit station, the statute was silent. And so we have come up with guidelines in the draft guidelines, come up with some locational direction that say that you should have reasonable access to the transit station based on street patterns, pedestrian connections, bicycle routes, or other areas, or following sustainable development principles and putting that multifamily district in an existing downtown, a village center, or an area of concentrated development. And we do know that some of the communities with no land area and no transit facility may actually have transit service from another regional transit authority. And so that would be another common sense place to locate your district. Next. I'm going to pass it on to Clark Ziegler.
Thanks, Chris. And also thank you, Secretary, for your leadership in this issue. It's been a pleasure working with you both on this. I'll be talking about technical assistance to communities to help them comply with the new law. And there's really no better way to start that conversation than with the slide in front of you now. On the right are a few real world examples of attractive multifamily housing that's been built in Massachusetts cities and towns at the densities required by the new Mbta zoning law. And there are many, many other similar examples across the Commonwealth, and we're certainly trying to pull a lot of those examples together. On the left is a graphic showing different housing types that can be developed at a density of 15 units an acre, ranging from small attached units to townhouses and garden apartments. It's clear that to successfully implement the new law, we need to show local residents that multifamily housing is not what they often fear, can be knit into the fabric of any community, and is an essential building block to create vibrant neighborhoods. I've been in state government a pretty long time, and I have to say I have never seen the level of coordination across agencies that I've seen with the implementation of this new law. We've been working not only with DHCD as the primary housing agency, but with MassDOT, with the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. And there's a reason, I think, that there is so much support and so much interest in getting this law successfully implemented. And the reason is that building multifamily housing in walkable neighborhoods near transit is good housing policy, it's good transportation policy, and it's good climate policy. And I think that's the reason that many of us are so enthusiastic about getting this done and getting it done right. I'll be talking mostly about assistance being provided by my organization, the Massachusetts Housing Partnership, or MHP. How we'll be providing information about available resources to communities on an ongoing basis, and the kinds of assistance we hope and expect to provide. MHP is launching 2 programs that will support the new law. One is a dedicated technical assistance program to help communities respond, and that program has 3 parts. One is a series of how-to webinars that we will put together with many of our agency and other partners, state agency and other partners. The second is support to communities, direct support to communities from third-party consultants and MHP planning staff. And third is an information clearinghouse that will be part of the state's online housing toolbox. The other initiative is a longer-term partnership between MHP and up to 6 communities to plan and promote walkable mixed-use neighborhoods around transit. Details on our programs and links to other resources are available now on a dedicated web page we've created at mhp.net/MBTA zoning. And over the next few months, we will be soliciting applications and selecting communities for technical assistance so that consultants can get right to work as soon as the MBTA zoning guidelines are finalized. And we'll open applications for the more in-depth community partnerships beginning next month. We intend to update these online resources on a regular basis. I know Chris and the Secretary both mentioned the mass.gov site that will also be a critical focal point for information. And we really want, at the community level, we really want and need to hear from you. Our webpage includes contact information for the MHP staff leading the programs. That's Katie Lacey for the Technical Assistance Program and Christine Medore for Community Partnerships. And we encourage you at any point in this process to reach out to them directly and stay in touch with us over the next few months as the guidance is being finalized. And as we think about implementation of the law, it's pretty clear that there are 2 kind of core challenges here in supporting communities and working with communities to make this successful. One is technical, and one is, I guess I would say, lowercase p, political. It's about the community engagement necessary to make these changes at the local level. On the technical side, we live in an era with incredible GIS mapping tools to help communities explore possible configurations for multifamily zoning districts and to confirm that the proposed districts will meet the state's guidelines. We're testing those mapping tools and methodologies now using the draft guidance so that cities and towns will have good planning tools available and a clear path forward when the guidelines are finalized later this year. I should also note our data team at MHP is right now completing a project to map every parcel in the Commonwealth, not just in the MBTA district, all the existing housing densities on every parcel and every square inch of the Commonwealth. So as a planning tool, communities will be able to align proposed new multifamily districts with existing densities and existing development patterns. So we think that'll be a real step forward in giving communities the tools to really make their own unique decisions. To the Secretary's point, this is not one size fits all. Every community is different. Every community has a different development history and different opportunities. And we want to create some of the technical resources to make that planning effort a success. On the small p political side, we recognize that good planning is only as successful as the community engagement and community buy-in behind it. And it really has to be said that adopting multifamily zoning districts that comply with the law requires an affirmative town meeting vote or an affirmative vote of a city council or town council, and that can be a big lift. And I think we need to recognize that. The more we can do to share best practices, to dispel myths about multifamily housing, and to help communities visualize their potential growth, the more successful we'll be. So speaking for my organization and for, I think, from all of our state partners, we're excited about moving forward here, and we look forward to working with you, in the coming months and years on this initiative. And with that, I will turn it back to Chris, and we will talk a little bit about some of the other state resources available. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Clark. Lots of good stuff coming from Mass Housing Partnership. In additional technical assistance, we are already aligning programs in the Community One Stop. The Community One Stop is the consolidated grant application program that I believe this year has 14 different programs from 3 different agencies. And so MBTA communities can apply for planning assistance through 3 programs, and these are actually programs that I oversee: the Housing Choice Grant Program, Community Planning Grants, and the Rural and Small Town Development Fund. Now, while these applications are going to be due, they open up in May and are due at the beginning of June. And we understand that maybe before the final guidelines are done, the contracting and availability of those funds will be right in line for and in a timely way for communities to start to undertake the compliance activities. So please do communities keep alert to those Community One Stop programs. The expression of interest is open right now for that program. And the guidelines for these 3 programs and all of the programs are posted, can be accessed through the Community One Stop page. So you can see how we are prioritizing MBTA community compliance in those planning grant programs. We're also working with our partners at the Executive Office of Environmental Affairs. They have a land use planning grant program that I believe opens in May, and they are going to prioritize MBTA compliance. And then we are working with our partners that are the regional planning agencies. There's actually 8 regional planning agencies that have MBTA communities within them. And through the District Local Technical Assistance, or DLTA funding, we're asking those 8 regional planning agencies to prioritize how they might use those funds to assist MBTA communities to reach compliance over this calendar year, and that will continue over the next few calendar years. And we're continuing to work on additional resources for additional technical assistance. As Clark has articulated, we know this is very important. We know there are heavy lifts for all of these MBTA communities, and we want to make sure that we're providing folks with the right assistance, whether it's consultants or regional planning agency staff. And we're going to be very, very coordinated in our approach to this to try and make it as simple and as straightforward to access these resources as we can. Next slide, please. So there is one very, very important piece of information I want to make sure that all the MBTA communities that are listening pay attention to. And this has been articulated on the website as how to comply in 2022. There is a requirement that if you're an MBTA community and you'd like to be eligible for this year's grant round for MassWorks and Housing Choice funding, that you complete and fill out the online MBTA community information form. Again, you can access that form on the MBTA website, and it's a fairly straightforward form. We ask for some basic information about existing zoning. We do ask and require that all of the MBTA communities discuss the draft guidelines at a meeting of your select board, city council, or town council, and provide evidence that you've done that. And then we have, as Clark mentioned, the GIS tools that are at our disposal are going to be very important for the demonstration to meet the draft guidelines and the final guidelines. And so there are a handful of communities that had out-of-date GIS parcel data, and we're working individually with those and the Mass GIS staff to make sure that everyone has up-to-date GIS parcel data submitted. The deadline for submitting this form is May 2nd, 2022. That's the opening of the application window for the MassWorks and Housing Choice grant programs. So as you can see, we're really aligned closely with that program. Next. And I'm going to turn it back to Secretary Keneally.
Great. Well, Clark and Chris, thanks so much. I just note a couple of things about the process here. So we're envisioning a robust stakeholder engagement process that effectively started on December 15th. We launched the draft guidelines. And with that, the website where folks can submit questions and comments. Really anticipating over these coming months to solicit a lot of input from communities, from key stakeholders. Part of that process, I'm counting now 76 questions in the Q&A. This will be very helpful to us to read and incorporate into our draft FAQ document. I don't anticipate that we'll answer every question individually, but this will certainly inform how we update the FAQ document that's on the website today. I will just note there's been a number of questions in the Q&A around 40B, and just to emphasize again, this really has nothing to do with 40B. It's not a production mandate like 40B is, and doesn't really intersect at all with that. So just maybe get that one topic out of the way. But there's a number of thoughtful questions and a number of technical questions, and I'm always impressed by how technical this work has to get to do it right. And this is really where Chris and Clark and others really excel at. So we do want to see your very detailed, specific questions and be able to provide thoughtful feedback on those. The final guidelines will be issued after a stakeholder engagement process. And with that, we expect communities can take some affirmative steps to create these multifamily districts. We're envisioning now the deadline to have a district that complies with the guidelines will be 2023 for subway, bus, and commuter rail communities, and then 2024 for the so-called Mbta adjacent communities. And I'll note as well that all those are defined in statute. What is an Mbta community? And we tried to take a thoughtful approach to what is the level of transit service within those communities. So that's our process. We want to hear from you both today and through the website. And please do consult the website with updates to the frequently asked questions document. And I think we have one more slide, then I'll turn it over to Undersecretary Maddox. Well, I think I just covered this. So draft guidelines on the website, how to comply in 2022, public comments, access to technical assistance. We will, Clark mentioned a number of folks on his team, and Chris did as well, that will be active in the technical assistance process, and we'll endeavor to provide kind of a streamlined front door to those services, if you will. Look, this is complicated technical stuff, and we want to be the most hands-on and engaged partner we can be to help communities understand this and ultimately to comply with it. So go back to mass.gov Mbta communities at your convenience. There's a lot there now. There'll be more to come. And with that, I will turn it over.
Okay. Do I have everybody still with me?
Yes, Greg, can I just take a moment just to mention
Sure.
that there are 2 attendees that do have their hands raised. And I just wanted to remind people who are attending right now, there are 64 total, 13 panelists and 51 attendees, that we're not taking public comment tonight. This is our presentation for the City Council and the Planning Board. And there's going to be plenty of opportunities for public feedback during this whole process. And Greg will be talking about that later. So I just wanted to be clear because their hands are raised. So thank you.
So I'm not sure that I could have done that justice, given that you were, hearing directly from the folks that have created the guidelines. And so the other thing I thought I could do, just, for folks that really want more information, again, the state has set up the resources for us all to respond to. So I'm just going to share again, but you won't be hearing the secretary any further. So I just have a couple of different locations for information that I want people to be aware of. So if you go to the mass.gov website, the state's website, they have a clearinghouse of information that's set up for you to see the legislation itself, just like you saw in the presentation, as well as the draft guidelines. There are frequently asked questions on that site as well that has been kind of continually populated as they've come across one that they've heard from multiple folks providing feedback to provide an answer to, so that again it's not a question that remains out there. The presentation that you just saw is also posted there. I apologize that the secretary and Chris Clutchman were cut off, but that's the way the presentation was posted to their website. And most importantly, I suppose, is how to provide feedback. The mayor spoke about this at the beginning of the meeting, and I'll also show the information that in many ways is mirrored on the city website. But again, if you navigate to mass.gov and type in MBTA community, you will be brought to this landing page. It has a table of contents, and in particular, feedback can come in a number of forms. I know that there are agencies throughout the state, associations like MMA, like the Massachusetts Municipal Lawyers Association, MAPC themselves as a regional planning authority are all going to be providing feedback on these draft guidelines. The city has the opportunity to do it as well. The mayor has set up a unique email address, which is MBTA feedback@gloucester-ma.gov. So if you want to be very specific about comments to the mayor on this topic, that's the email address to use, and those are going to be cataloged and provided for the public to view, as well as the council. But the other thing you can do is you can actually, provide feedback directly to the state. And I'm trying to just move this bar. Okay. So if you were to click on that landing page to submit public comment, that will take you to this web page, which is just nested within the state site, where you can provide your name and address, your contact information, should you want also feedback or an acknowledgement that your comment has been made. The type of concern that you might have, they're, again, also trying to catalog the response they get from the public. And then you can also either type or attach written comment. Again, I pointed out that there's a frequently asked questions section of the website. Any of the particulars that were introduced in terms of district size, density, how to comply, technical assistance opportunities, they're all there on the city on the state website. And I believe this was presented at the city council, maybe last meeting. The council president introduced that we do have a section on the city website. It's under the city council, particularly where the current zoning amendments that the city council will be discussing at future meetings, as well as a single page with information about the MBT community zoning. Again, it will link you to the law itself, which was presented in what you just saw this evening, the guidelines, as well as the steps that need to be taken. And as the mayor pointed out, there's really only two. We can check one off tonight. You've all been informed on the law and the draft guidelines. And so that's one thing that we have to provide to DHCD, that we held a meeting with the city council. I'm glad that we have planning board members here as well, but there was only the requirement for the city council. And then that's online submittal, which is basically indicates we are the city of Gloucester. It will be filled out by the mayor, in that we, at this present time, do not have a zoning district that complies with the guidelines. And again, that's an important thing to distinguish also. We don't know what these final guidelines will look like. I have attended a number of different information sessions. There's a lot of different aspects of the law itself and also the draft guidelines that folks are taking exception with. So it will be, we are a little bit in a wait and see also after providing feedback, what these final guidelines might look like. So that's kind of what I have for now in terms of resources that people can go to. They can, again, start on our city website if they choose to. They will be taken to the state website because that's really where the clearinghouse of information is. And that's kind of where we are at this point. So I don't know how you want to conduct the rest of the evening, but that's that's the information at this point that we have available.
Greg, I have two quick things. First, welcome to Jill Cahill, our CAO. She's been on the call for about a half an hour, and I didn't introduce her earlier. And I was wondering if you could go to the second page of that fact sheet, because there are some important dates that are on that document that I just want to kind of reiterate. If you don't mind screen sharing that again.
Nope. That right there.
Yes, okay. So would you mind walking through that for us? Because
Sure.
kind of these are important for us locally to understand. So
Yep.
thank you.
And again, this also can be downloaded. You can create a printable version, but it is a web page on the city website. So here we are tonight, about 50 minutes after 6 p.m. There needed to be a required presentation to the city council of the draft guidelines. And again, we thought kind of no better way than to have it come from those that are actually developing the guidelines and will be potentially responding to the public comment. Because again, state law, state guidelines for MBTA communities. So that's the March 9th date. March 21st, the mayor has set kind of an internal deadline for public comment. If you want to specifically provide feedback to Mayor Verga, you can use, again, that email address of mbtafeedback@gloucester-ma.gov. Those will all be reviewed by the administration in the development of the mayor's comment to DHCD on the draft guidelines. Again, pointing out by the 31st of March is the deadline for public comment. The state has done its own outreach in a variety of ways, not quite as intimate as this in terms of, trying to provide a community by community delivery of information. And they kind of pushed that off to us to do as well. But we're happy to do it to make sure that people are seeing this information and the accurate information from the state. But if you choose to provide your own comment, you don't want to be a part of the administration's comment, which may be different from your own, and want to be heard as an individual or groups of individuals, you can go again back to that state website, mass.gov, and navigate to the MBTA community section. And there is that online submission that you can make. I believe if I click on this, it will also probably take us like magic directly to the page. So again, you can utilize the information on the city website, but I would certainly encourage folks to go directly to the mass.gov site. And then again, as the mayor has pointed out, taking into consideration everything that he's learned about this process through his own outreach, as well as from the feedback from the community, he will be providing comments to the HCD on the 31st. We talked about those other timelines. The only thing that would remain is basically the community submission to the HCD about basic information about our current zoning. And the state has not indicated when they will finalize these guidelines. That will occur sometime probably in the summer months. So that's where we are.
Thank you. And I would just like to add something. You can get rid of your thing. So thank you. You screen share your thing. So one of the things I just wanted to comment on as well is that the city council has put as a possible council vote on the 22nd of March, just to see if we as a council want to submit a joint comments to the state before the deadline. So we just have that as a placeholder, and we'll be looking closely at the feedback that comes in, because we should have that by the end of the day on the 21st. And we look forward to seeing that. And then we will discuss an open session if we wish to put something in, as I said, as a joint resolution or comments or feedback to the state. So anyway, so that is that concludes Greg's presentation. So what I'd like to do is rotate back and forth from the planning board to the city council to see if you have any specific questions to ask of Greg Cadamatore. I think Council Memard, your hand is raised, so why don't you begin?
Thank you, and thank you for the very helpful presentation and overview. It is an adventure, and it's clearly well-intentioned, and it's going to be interesting to see how it pans out for us. My one specific question for Greg at this point is just being clear. We naturally tend to think about the downtown Railroad Avenue district as being our impacted zone, but what about our West Gloucester station? How does that factor in to the overall response that we're looking to provide?
So again, I think it certainly can be included. The guidance is that you have to have one district in the community that complies. But if you have multiple stops or multiple train stations, they can be included in that. Again, regardless of what the measuring stick is in terms of what's required in terms of the number of units, and again, it's about the capacity. It's not about production, but if you create the capacity, you can expect some production. But one of the points that's been made is, the approach does not necessarily have to be just an underlying zoning district change. It can be in an overlay form, and an overlay can have different areas of a community. Again, it still would have to fall into the compliance of the proximity to a train station, but it's possible that it could be broken up as well. Again, it's not something that I have spent any time evaluating, because at this point we don't have finalized guidelines. All of this could change. I don't know, again, it's a matter of the legislation provided for an agency to come up with guidelines, and they're in the process of taking feedback, and it's a matter of whether those are modified further. So until that time, I think there's been some also FAQ response to some of those questions, because as you can imagine, there are a number of communities with multiple stops, with different types of transportation, and how that will play out in terms of the geography of a potential district. And again, they've also created this, this minimum size of a district, but then also talk about within half a mile, and that's a range between about 50 to 500 acres. And so, as you can imagine, using the density calculations that they are imposing on the different types of services that a community has, smaller the district, the higher the density. So there, again, that's the flexibility that the state has provided.
Rick, do you want to see if any members of the planning board have any questions, and then we'll rotate back to the city council?
Well, I'm happy for you to go through the city council first.
Okay, thank you. So I saw Council Worthley had his hand raised. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Greg, for a great presentation. It's a lot to comprehend all at once. I have a lot of questions, but I'll be brief.
Why don't we share the floor and you can ask one question, then we'll rotate back. Thank you.
Okay. So March 21st is 12 days away, 8 business days. Is it remotely reasonable? I think it's great we have 52 attendees on tonight, but we represent 30,000 people. How are we going to capture public input in 8 business days? And what
Well, I
happens-
wouldn't suggest that this is the state's outreach.
Mhm.
So they are the ones that have set the stage for how they're going to collect public comment. They've provided a direct link. People don't have to use the city council or the administration as a pass-through. They can go directly and provide their comments. It's a matter of whether the city as a whole, the city council wishes to provide your own feedback, in which case, again, this is what has been set up as another opportunity to provide feedback, but it is essentially the state's, they set up the structure of having direct feedback going to them as well. So I think this is an added thing that the mayor has asked for. If folks would like to advise him directly, And he, I think, indicated that he would be happy to share that comment as well.
Councilor Gilman, can I ask a very related follow-up question?
Sure, absolutely. Thank you.
What happens if we don't, as a municipality, create a response to this?
There's no requirement to provide feedback. It is an opportunity that the state is providing. If there are particulars or questions or clarifications or responses, I think the mayor intends to provide feedback, but there is no requirement to provide it.
Okay.
Thank
I'll
you.
have more questions, but
I
I'll
saw
share the floor.
Councilor Grow had his hand raised.
I'm trying to figure out how to jam all my questions into one.
Right, we'll get back. to you.
Semicolons.
So my understanding is that they've had a year, they enacted this legislation a year ago. They are only now putting together the guidelines that we're supposed to be ready to accept when they finish finalizing these things. So we don't really know what the final guidelines are going to end up being before sometime later on this year. What if we already have the density required in the zoning? Are we still required to come up with multifamily by right, even if we have the density that they're requiring with multifamily development that's existing within the within our railroad zone, the Ward 2 and Ward 3? And where does that district actually have to be? It says about half a mile, but it has to be within a half a mile. The district has to touch that half-mile point, correct? Did you
So
get
it has, I think as Chris Glutchman pointed out, it has to be within a half a mile of the MBTA property that the station resides on. So it does not have to touch it, but it has to be reasonably within a half a mile of that location. There has been, some other analyses that have been performed by other agencies or associations. The issue is the density that is there right now is not allowed by right. And that is one of the tenets of the legislation, is it has to be allowed by right. So that's one piece of it. But I will say that, there's a lot of focus that's also been placed on the number. They are calculating, they are saying 15% of the 2020 census housing stock. And that number, you can also on the state website, if you scroll down, you can type in Gloucester, it does the calculation and provides for you that number is 2,270 units. It's not 2,270 new units. That is the capacity the district has to have. So if we had 50 acres with 220 or 2,270 units on it, and we created a district that said that can happen by right, you would have satisfied the requirement. Obviously, it's a little bit more complicated than that. And that's where I think there's a lot of challenge to figure out exactly how these things will be evaluated, because there are a lot of different factors. So it does have to be proximate. We have 2 train stations. That's another issue. And there's a lot of factors, but again, it's about the capacity of the district, and the state law is requiring you to create a zoning district that will satisfy the area requirement and the capacity requirement.
Thank you. How about a new person on the city council that wants to ask a question? Councilor Gross.
Thank you. Had a couple of, more than a couple, but Greg, as I read it, the senior housing is not eligible to be counted, correct?
I think what they're suggesting is that you cannot create a district that restricts age by age.
That's
So-
not my question.
I'm sorry?
It says that, so that would lead me, so we cannot count those units.
So this is the complexity. This is some of the stuff that's not super clear. But if you were to blanket a district over an area and say that this can happen. It doesn't matter that it isn't right now, but that in the future it could be unrestricted. So those are some of the complexities of some of the uses in the area in the downtown and how they will contribute or not be counted towards the overall density requirements. So it may be that that area, you know, if you had a senior housing area, it may be disqualified, which will ultimately, based on the area of a potential district, will reduce its overall, you know, units per density per unit area.
It's huge in Gloucester. In that area, it's huge. You know, you got, I mean, all of them are in that whole radius. So
Yes, they are.
that's just in, you know, so anyway, also just another thing is their number that they're using is off by 2,000 units to come up with the federal census is 13,111 and they're using 15,133 to come up with it. So it's they dumped 303 more units on us than we actually have. So you might want to check that out on the census.
Duly noted. We will look into that. Who else would like to ask a question on the council right now? Okay, I'm going to ask a question, then we'll go around again. I have a question on the land that is capable of being developed, and I'm looking at the description of the words on the guidelines. And it says it means land on which multifamily housing units have been or can be permitted and constructed. Developable land shall not include land under water, wetland, resource areas lacking adequate water or wastewater infrastructure capacity, publicly owned land that is dedicated to existing public uses, or privately owned land encumbered by any kind of use restriction that prohibits residential use. So going back to the previous question about the West Gloucester Transit Station, isn't a large part of that wetlands? And if so, would that actually be a possibility for this to apply?
Again, haven't tried to evaluate a district at this point because they're only draft guidelines, but there are 2 transit stations. Clearly, you know, that would be part of the area that would be disqualified. I mean, it does sit in very close proximity to the Little River, which cannot be built on. So I'm not sure what, you know, again, what would that mean in terms of, you know, a district might have to be larger or extended in another area if there are areas that, you know, would be excluded.
Thank you. So I don't see any other hands up. So I'm going to go back to Jeff Worthley and then I'll go back to Council Grow.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Another question for Greg. You'd said earlier in the meeting that if we are not in compliance, then we're not eligible for the Housing Choice Grant, the Community Planning Grant, and the, I can't remember, Rural and Small Town Development Fund. Are we, for in fiscal year 2023, right? For that's this year, starting in July. Is that correct?
So I think you, I didn't report that. That was in the presentation from the state. But the 3 funds that are identified are the Housing Choice, the Mass Works, and the Commonwealth Local Capital Fund.
So if we're not in compliant, meaning we don't accept this, or we don't provide, I'm sorry, we don't provide the housing in that time frame, we don't get money in fiscal year 23. How would we even pull this together in the next 4 months? And what happens if we, I'm sorry?
Right, I'm sorry to interrupt you because I just want to cut it off at, all we have to do is submit the online form that talks about our current zoning. That keeps us in compliance for this coming round of the grant programs that are administered through the one-stop process with the state. It's those other timelines that were identified that you would have to have an action plan at some point submitted, which I think comes later in this calendar year. And then ultimately for MBTA communities with commuter rail, the zoning would have to be in place by December 31st, 2024. So there's a bit of a timeline out there. The only other additional piece for compliance at this point is providing the state a representation of this meeting occurred. The posted agenda, I think, will probably suffice, and perhaps a link to the recording, as well as filling out the online form for the community that the mayor intended to do before, I believe it's May 2nd, which then allows us to continue on with any grant applications that we might submit for this fiscal year.
So if we're in compliance for this fiscal year, it doesn't commit us to necessarily passing those zoning changes.
There's nothing that will commit you to passing those zoning amendments. You will be able to make that decision. The state has set up consequences if you're not compliant, but it will be a city council decision to enact zoning.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Grow.
I just want to,
Can you hold on?
I thought, what's
Okay,
that?
and then I'll go to Councilor O'Neill. She just raised her hand, but you started to speak, so go ahead.
Yes, I did. So the, I want to, Jeff was almost to where I wanted to go with this. What are we looking at in terms of actual amounts of money that are at risk in terms of these grant programs? And how would the loss of that money impact the community based on what we've received in the past?
Thanks for the softball, Jason. Sorry to be casual. Sorry to be casual. I will say, what you didn't hear in this presentation, and the secretary has provided additional presentations on this to a number of different venues. The words that he uses or has used is mandate, for one, that the law itself says shall, it doesn't say think about it, consider it, it says shall. So that's one aspect of it. Indicated that not very often does the state mandate. It often incentivizes, provides grant funding, provides a lot of different resources to communities. But that the resources that have been identified that we have applied for and received in the past, we have successfully received MassWorks grants for infrastructure, mostly water and sewer infrastructure, sometimes road work. The housing choice program we are not eligible for. We don't produce housing at a rate that is a minimum point of entry into that program. The third source, the Commonwealth Local Capital Fund, is revenue from the gaming industry. And exactly how that gets allocated, I'm not certain, and it hasn't been provided in any of the presentations on how those funds get used. But I will also point out that they said that this is the starting point, that there are other discretionary or competitive grant programs that any one of them that are administered by the executive office can have requirements to indicate, you check a box whether you are compliant or not, and that has a bearing on the receipt of grants. I am not saying this to instill fear or say that you should or shouldn't do anything. It's just what the state has been providing. So have we been successful for those grants in the past? Yes. Some of them are on the order of multi-million-dollar grant applications that have been funded. It also, and again, that would be, if we were not eligible for them, then we would have to take other approaches to how we fund things. They're not something that we receive or apply for on an annual basis, but they are, in our current state, we certainly are eligible to apply for them on an annual basis if they are.
Thank you, Greg. Councilor O'Neill.
Yes, thank you. Hold on one second, I'm sorry. You stated that it doesn't have to be within a half mile of the rail station? Is that right? 'Cause I have a summary of the draft guidelines for MBTA communities, and it clearly states not more than 1/2 mile from the rail station. So.
I didn't say that. I don't think I
Okay.
said that. Yeah.
Okay, all right. Okay. Thank you.
Counselor Gross.
Yeah, just to back up Greg's point to your, Jason, on item number 11 in that, in the guidelines, it says the DHCD may at its discretion take non-compliance into consideration when making other discretionary grant awards. So it's right in their guidelines. They don't mask that
Yeah,
they're not, that
I
they're,
just wanted to know how much money that meant in terms of.
it
real-
could be lots of money.
Yeah.
If they, but
If they-
also I just want to make a comment that I think that this is being met with a fair amount of pushback. So I don't know if what we're looking at today will be what the final product is. So that's it.
Other questions, counselors?
Through the chair.
Rick
Council
Noonan.
So I think the point, Jason, that you're trying to get to is, and granted that these aren't two popular programs, but through the Works Grant Program during the hotel discussion, we got $3.2 million to improve water and sewer to serve the fort and to the hotel. And if you recall, during the Fuller School redevelopment exercise, the pump station was not adequate. And the concept of having a 12 or 14 acre parcel with 200 units and thousands of square feet of retail space that could not flush a toilet. They received at least, in my recollection, $2.8 to $3 million worth of sewer improvement to Trask Street and the underlying pump station to meet that requirement. So granted, not popular programs, major investments in the city, over $125 million, but the skids were greased by the Works Grant Program, to put it simply. And frankly, have been part of both of those projects on the planning board. Neither one of the applicants was willing to pay for it. And they came back to us as the city saying, I don't care if I have to flush a toilet, you have to pay for it, right? And so those were impediments that were solved by the Works Grant Program. Thank you. Council
Thank you for
President.
that clarification, Rick. All right, who else would like to speak? Beverly. Thank you.
We still have a comment from the council, if you want to give the council's first crack before the planning members speak. I'd be glad to hold my.
Oh, I think at this point we can just open it up if that's.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm a member of the planning board for 3 years and have lived in Gloucester for 5 years. And before I came here, I was a planning consultant for 35 years in Portland, Oregon, as was my dear friend, Chris Eaton-Kluchman, who is a close friend and professional colleague, even though she's now been practicing land use in Massachusetts for about 12 years. The proposal ahead of us has so many technical aspects. And this is an introductory session. It is not a session for discussing technical issues. And so I'm going to propose that maybe there be a working group composed of interested city council members and planning board members to work, to do the behind the scenes work on working through these regulations. So many technical aspects. I took 2 pages of notes as a land use planner, and I fully understand what the state is trying to do in a way that many of you are not, just because Greg and I both are land use planning professionals. But I'd like to make a policy statement and a clarification. Today, our zoning code, the densest residential district is an R5, which means 1 unit per 5,000 square feet. that works out to a density of 8.8 units to the gross acre. And the way you get that is that you divide an acre, 43,560 square feet by 5,000, and you get 8.8. Obviously, you don't build 0.8 of a house, but on 10 acres, that means R5 would generate about 88 units. So we have half as many. Our zoning, we have our smallest zoning code permits half as many housing units as the state is talking about. So just everybody, just so people know what the base we're starting from is an R5, and we need something more like an R2.5 in order to get to the densities that the state is looking at, which would be 1 unit for every 2,500 square feet of land. I come from Oregon, where we have a very robust top-down planning system, probably the cutting edge in the United States, 50 years old this year, adopted first in 1970. And because it's a top-down system, all of our cities are required to do comprehensive planning that they have to update every 5 to 7 years to prove that they have enough land to meet their 20-year population growth in terms of both housing and jobs. And because we are required in that comprehensive planning process to look at the full range of housing needs of our population in terms of socioeconomic, household size, housing preference, and so on, the city is required to have enough zoning to meet all of those needs, from the very wealthiest people who want single-family houses on 1 and 2 acre to people who want to live in dense apartment complexes. It just depends, of course, on the city and its sophistication and its population characteristics. But that means that there is not a jurisdiction in the state of Oregon that does not have multifamily districts by right. The state of Washington has a state land use plan. There is not an urban jurisdiction that does not have 1 or more multifamily jurisdictions by right. So you can imagine that when I came to Massachusetts, I was shocked that there are many jurisdictions that do not have multifamily districts by right, which means that all apartment, any kind of density above 8.8 units to the acre has to go through special permit, which leaves it open to all sorts of delays and court challenges and everything else that adds time and cost to the development of that housing. We live in a community that, other than Salem, I believe, has the lowest median family income on the North Shore. And at least 40% of the people who live in our community are housing insecure. And it really is not a matter of how much money we'll lose from state programs. It's really not a matter of this top down, you have to do this. This is really a matter of equity, and it's a matter of meeting the needs, the housing needs of the people who live in this community and who have a right to live in safe, economically viable housing. And that's why I really urge us to take this as an opportunity to look at our zoning code and to look, especially in a station area where you've got the potential of high density transportation, to utilize that full benefit, to use the facilities of downtown to encourage more density and mixed use in our downtown neighborhood. From my way of thinking as a land use planner, with my Oregon bias, I am sorry to say, I really feel that this is a terrific opportunity, and we should look at it as a positive opportunity and not as, oh my goodness, the state's imposing on this. How are we going to deal with this? So that's my policy statement, and I'll be glad to serve on a joint committee to bring my technical expertise to join that of my good friend Greg here, to see if we can come up with an approach to this that meets the state. That's important, but more importantly, meets the needs of our community. Thanks much.
Yeah, thank you, Beverly.
I just want to correct one thing. We do allow 2 family by right in the R5 district. So we're actually slightly above the 15 unit per acre But the state's requirement is for multifamily, and the cut-in definition by the state's definition is 3-family. So just, I agree with a lot of things that you said, you know, in terms of looking at things. And again, I will continue to say it over and over again. That's what the housing production plan process was about, was trying to find the balance of meeting the community need. And we need to continue to talk about that, because I know we're talking about a lot of specifics right now. The council will be taking that up in a couple of weeks. But the broader discussion about how to meet community need and affordability, and I know that's a big part of the discussion as well, is an ongoing discussion.
Thank you, Greg. Councilor O'Neill, you have your.
Yes, yep, thank you, Madam Chairperson. I don't have a question, but I do want to point something out in case some of you didn't get a chance to read all the guidelines in the packet. Under the draft guidelines for multifamily districts, under paragraph 7, determining suitability for families with children, it says section 3A states that a compliant multifamily district must be without age restrictions and must be suitable for families with children. DHCD will deem a multifamily district to comply with these requirements as long as the zoning does not require multifamily uses to include units with age restrictions and does not place limits or restrictions on the size of the units, the number of bedrooms, the size of the bedrooms, or the number of occupants. To me, that's problematic. The number of occupants in a 2-bedroom, I've dealt with that with a tenant, and it was not, it was less than ideal. If you'll let me speak a little bit longer, I'd like to talk about the transit-oriented development overlay. Would that be okay?
Counselor, I think we want to just keep this to questions right now, and stay on that path. So if you have something that's related to a question, then sure.
Well, I have a printout from the Housing Innovations Program, and it says on one page one thing, and it says on the page directly after another thing. So, and it has to do with transit-oriented development overlays produced by the Housing Innovations Program. So it's not really a question, it's just pointing out that it contradicts itself in the next page. So I don't know if anyone's read that, or if anyone knows about that, or if it's the, I don't know if I can read it.
Could you send that to Greg tomorrow and allow him to ask that question on your behalf?
Okay, who's going to ask the state?
I'm not clear what the resource is that you're looking at.
It's, I don't know if you can see this. Can you see that? Wait a minute. Can you see that? It says transit-oriented development overlays, and it was produced by the Housing Innovations Program, Puget Sound Regional Council. Could you see that on my camera? I can't see what you see, so.
That would be Washington State.
Okay, but it's still a TOD, right?
In Washington State.
Okay, all right, then. Okay.
Greg, can you confirm that TOD is unique here in Massachusetts and is different, has different requirements in all the different states? I think that's.
I mean, there's volumes of information about transit-oriented development, and it means a lot of different things to different regions, type of transportation. You know, but the idea of focusing housing around amenities and transportation, particularly public transportation, is not something that's a new concept.
Okay. Thank you.
So-
Tracy, I would suggest that you send that to Greg, and you guys can talk offline about that.
Okay.
but thank you. Any other questions from counselors? Jeff Worthley.
Thank you. Craig, there was a map that we saw earlier in the presentation, and I just wanted to know how many acres are included in that district in the map that you had. Do you remember seeing
In the
that?
map that I had.
The map, I'm sorry, there's a TOD map that we're working with, and I want to get an idea of how much space we're talking about. Does that cover 50 acres, or are we? I'm sorry, I want to ask my question clearly. If you, there's a map with a dotted line all around it that was on one of the screens that we were looking at. Maybe I saw it in the city.
Was it during the presentation from the state?
No, and I might have confused it with something I saw on the city's website. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Let me find it.
I mean, I can tell you that, again, you know, the half-mile area, particularly in the downtown area from the train station, pretty much goes from about the extension to the water. That's about the half-mile area. And for an area that's about, you know, 50 acres, kind of the bullseye in the middle around the train station. I think if you're referring to, you know, some past graphics, there was a effort back in 2012 and also in maybe the resources on the planning board share file that's available to the public. That graphic is probably something less than 50, but not that far off.
Okay. Thank you for that.
I've got a question, and then we'll go to Jason. Greg, on page 5 of the guidelines, it talks about unit capacity, and it brings up setback requirements and parking space requirements applicable to that district under the zoning ordinance or bylaw. Where do we go with that issue of parking space and this proposal? Because obviously this is something, this proposal is very relevant to transit, but yet there are a lot of people in the community that are qualified, but they have multiple cars. Is that something that is part of our recommendations here that we need to be aware of? Do we have data on how many folks that would qualify for affordable housing? How many of them own cars, and how that fits into this?
I think the point there, and I don't have the document right in front of me, but I think the point was, again, they want, if you're going down the path of trying to create a compliant district, you cannot have requirements in it that would essentially prohibit it from happening. So you can't say that, you know, you create a district that, you know, the lot size is X, but the, you know, the setback requirements are Y, and it basically doesn't create a buildable area. So, you know, that's the part that we, again, first, if we're even going down this path of trying to come up with a compliant district, the type of evaluation that the state will be doing to evaluate whether the zoning as proposed would qualify or not, again, is really around, can you actually build the capacity with the zoning tool that you've created? So you can't say, you know, you can do, you know, 15 units per acre, but you have to have 20 parking spaces, because you can't, it just dimensionally won't work. Or you can do it on this certain size, but you have to have a 50-foot setback. So they're just trying to say, don't try to be cute with it. You're either going to create the capacity or you're not going to comply.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. Councilor Grow, you had your hand up. You're muted.
I know, I'm just getting there. I'm still want to make sure that we're clear about what it means to have the district within half a mile of the station. We're not talking about drawing a half-mile circle around the train station and creating that as our district, because that's 500 acres. We're just saying that somewhere within that 500 acres, we have to have 50 at least 50 acres with zoning that is allowed multifamily by right. Is that my understanding? Is my understanding correct about this? And also that doesn't have to, does it have to fit all within that half mile, or does it just have to reside within, begin at some point within that half mile zone?
I think that's one of those points that was qualified. They're giving you, they're basically saying you have 500 acres to work with. The minimum size of the district is 50, but you also have a capacity requirement. So, what that, if it was 50 acres, it would have to have a density of 45 units per acre.
Okay.
Based on the calculation that they have provided, again, which Councilor Gross and Grow. How did that happen in one legislative session? Councilor Gross pointed out, it's dependent on that base number and the calculation of the capacity that has to be provided. But again, if you did it based on that same calculus, if you had 150 acres to work with, your density would be at around 15.
Right.
So 15 units at 150 acres plus or minus would get you to that capacity. Again, and that's the minimum, is that 15 units per acre. So it can't really get much bigger unless you increased the density allowance.
Beverly.
I have a question for Greg. I've listened to this presentation twice now. I'm under the impression that the 15% or the 2,270 units, which I believe someone has suggested we need to be able to correct, which we can, but for purposes of conversation, let's say it's 2,270, that we have to have 2,270 of our 2020 housing stock, and we get to count units that are already built, including, by the way, senior housing. It's just that the new housing can't be aged. Am I misunderstanding that, or do we have to provide 2,270 new units? I think that's a very important clarification.
Yeah, we certainly don't have to provide 2,200 or 2,270 new units. It's the district has to provide for that capacity. So again,
that's interesting. I didn't see it that way.
Yeah. So, and there are certain things that will be excluded from the calculation. It also comes down to how you draw the district, because if there's something that won't count, and you did it, for instance, with an overlay approach, you could exclude something by boundary. But it's one of the examples that I was listening to in terms of feedback on questions. Say there's a building on a 10,000 square foot lot that has 30 units on it. It's a matter of what your as of right zoning says can be on that. So it will only be kind of realized in terms of what the zoning says can happen on that 10,000. It doesn't actually say, because you have your over density here, you have to provide less. It's complicated. They haven't really fully fleshed out how they're going to evaluate things, but it's the capacity that's created by your zoning, not necessarily the existing housing stock. Some communities might have the ability, if they had 50 acres of multi-story and created a zoning district that said you can do 5 floor, you can do X density, they could be done, because the density would already have been provided for by the zoning. So it's almost like a back calculation of capacity, but it already exists. So in that case, they wouldn't necessarily see any new development at all or have to provide any.
If I could just make one more point, though, that's technical, and we're not doing a technical deep dive, and this one happens to be very deep dive, is that when they talk about zoning, you're implying the zone either on vacant land, which is never developed, or on what we consider underdeveloped land, so that it's an overlay. The underlying uses that are there are allowed by right forever. They're allowed by right because they were allowed when they were built. But should that the market push redevelopment, then the new development has to be at the new densities. And as a result of putting this overlay on existing, you can count those potential future units. And remember, the city isn't building any of them. The market is building them. It's just providing the capacity so that if the market so moves in that direction, and there is a demand for higher density housing in our community, looking at our housing, looking at our socioeconomic profile, then the market will be able to take advantage of the zoning.
Does anyone else have any questions? Tony Gross, Councilor Gross.
Yeah, Greg, so it's my understanding that it's 3-family and above is, and it doesn't matter what size the unit is. It can be a 3-family with 3 single bedroom units in it. Is that correct?
It's what yeah, so there's no restriction. If someone chose to do that, they could do that, but there's no limitation on bedroom size, unit size, or number of bedrooms. So it's, but it has to be a minimum of a 3-unit building.
Okay,
Or it could potentially be the allowance of multiple buildings on a lot.
So my next follow-up on that is none of our 2 families count. None of those units count.
Correct.
Correct. So it's only the existing 3-family or above, which by the language the way I read the law, it says that the senior housing is out, not qualified. So we're down to a very minimal amount of properties, but we can gerrymander the whole district to, capture streets that have the most 3 families on it also, according to what they say in the guidelines.
Councilor O'Neill and then Councilor Memhard.
Thank you, Madam Chairperson. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the units have to be family friendly, so they cannot be 1-bedroom apartments. Is that correct, Greg?
We can't require anyone to build anything they don't want to build. So it's saying you cannot restrict them. So if you had zoning that said you can only build 1-bedroom units or units of a certain size, that would be counter to what they're suggesting.
Right, so the 1-bedroom apartments would not count.
I don't know that if you had a zoning that said you're not limited to the number of bedrooms that you can build or the size of the units, and someone chose, again, the zoning, they're talking about setting the table with the zoning and saying, there's nothing in here that restricts the ability for family, to reside in units. There's nothing that restricts the size. If somebody chooses to do otherwise, there's nothing in our zoning that we can tell somebody you can't build a 1-bedroom unit. So again, it's about, and the question would be, would somebody build a 1-bedroom unit if they had the ability, not being restricted by size or number of bedroom, whether they would do it. But we can't create a zoning that would restrict to only that type of housing.
Right, but so if they do build, say they build a multifamily complex, I guess, of 40 units, and they have 5 of them as 1-bedrooms, the state of Massachusetts or the MBTA of the state of Massachusetts, I guess, would negate those 5 1-bedroom apartments because they're not family friendly. Is that right? I mean, I'm trying to figure it out, so.
Yeah, it's a matter of what you dictated in your zoning. If you said you could build unrestricted number of bedrooms and someone chose to do that and created in again, I think we're really getting way down in the weeds, because I don't think we're talking about allowing, I don't know that we're talking about allowing anything at this point, but I think that the point is they're basically infusing fair housing law in their requirements and saying you cannot restrict by income, you cannot restrict by family type, size of family, You have to provide for the housing to be created. Again, as of right, and it has to have a minimum of 3 units, and you can't say how big it can be or how many bedrooms can be in it.
Okay.
Sounds like that might be a feedback question to get some clarification on, because I certainly don't have the answer. I think I understand what they're saying. You can't restrict, but if somebody chooses to build something a certain way under the allowance of the ordinance that doesn't have those restrictions, again, this is not about production and qualifying and counting in the future. At this point, they have said it's only about creating the environment to build multifamily housing by right without restriction. So it is not about production. It's not about affordability. It's about allowing for multifamily to be constructed by right in these proximities to transit and having a certain capacity in the community.
Okay, all right, thank you.
So it looks like we have one last question, or two, Scott Memard, but I'll, Jason, you had your hand up first, so.
Yeah,
Counselor-
I guess I want to reinforce Tracy's consternation here, because the actual act as it's written on the page says that they shall be suitable for families with children. And shall is a requirement that it has to be suitable for children. And a 1-bedroom apartment, generally speaking, would not be suitable for families with children. I mean, obviously there are people who live in 1 rooms, but I don't think that that's the anticipation of the legislation, is that we're going to create a lot of single studio 1-bedroom apartments where you're going to have potentially multiple children. So, I mean, I guess the question I would have is, we should have this clarified, because what do they mean by shall be suitable for families with children? Because I think that makes a difference in the definition of how we provide zoning guidance in terms of how many units or how many bedrooms we would require in a as of right construction. I mean, it seems a little, I mean, I understand Tracy's frustration with this, because I share it.
Thank you, Jason.
So that would be great to pose that question in the Q&A and then send us information only on the response, because I think that that's valuable information. So thank you for bringing that up, Tracy.
you.
Councilor Memhard.
I'm struggling just to try and visualize what is envisioned if this was to materialize and roll out as we're being requested to consider creating a groundwork that would allow that to happen. And I'm trying to equate it to things that we're familiar with here in Gloucester already. For example, the Maplewood Avenue apartments that were converted from an old industrial building on Maplewood Avenue is a 4-story, I believe it's 70 units. I'm not sure the configuration within that, single family or 2-bedroom or whatever. Next door is our Willowdale Gloucester Housing Authority project, which has another 60 units. We have, as been noted, several senior housing projects that are within the district that are typically conversions. Are they looking at buildings, for example, that we're familiar with at Lee Pages or at the top of the harbor? Is that the sort of congregate housing structure that we would anticipate this zoning would encourage construction of in the downtown railroad district?
Greg, can you take?
Is that directed to me? I'm sorry, I wasn't sure.
I don't know anything about the answer to that.
No, I mean, I think, you know, the steps that will be taken would be, they finalize the guidelines. And I would see that this would be a lot of visualization. I mean, they've provided, you know, not the greatest examples that necessarily translate to Gloucester, but understanding existing projects and you know, existing buildings in the landscape and their density is an important one. And like you said, in terms of, you know, what would this actually look like? And again, pointing out the genesis of everything that's in front of you right now is not this, but a 3-unit on a 5,000 square foot lot surpasses the density requirement of 15 units per acre. So I think it could take on a lot of different forms. 3-family and 4-family are in the R5 district are beyond that density. And then it's a matter of, where would you provide for that? So I think there's a lot more that we have to learn in terms of what the guidelines will ultimately be and what compliance will look like. And I do appreciate I appreciate Councilor O'Neill and Councilor Grove's question much better now that I understand what you're saying is, because there is quite the possibility of conversions, for instance, and maybe it's a 1-bedroom unit. And how is that considered from the state's perspective in terms of enabling housing for family? My interpretation was it was more that you cannot put restrictions in, but I think it has to be clarified too. Well, what does it mean if the zoning approach is for the addition of smaller units because that's what the capacity and the landscape makes sense for community A? How does that translate to compliance?
Thank you. So Councilor O'Neill, go ahead. Last question, and I think we should wrap up. Go ahead.
Okay, it's not a question. If it's 15 units per acre, an acre is like 43,000 square feet, is that correct? So just imagine, so just for me to put it into perspective, that would be the R40 zoning, right? So if you take, if you have a house, one house on 1 acre, just imagine, for the people listening, if you have one house on that acre, just imagine what a 15-unit complex would look like. And each unit would, in my mind, have to be 2 bedrooms or more, because in my mind, 1 bedroom is not family friendly. So I'm just trying to put it into sizes. So if you live in an R40 district, you can imagine that. And so that's what I just wanted to say.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I am ready for our closing comments and then adjourning. So I'd like to ask Chairperson Noonan, do you have anything you'd like to say to kind of wrap up this informational meeting?
Thank you, Council President Gilman. I think the position, at least from the planning board's perspective over the last, and I know you all know about that we've worked on these recommendations for 3+ years, harbor planning or the housing production plan, subcommittees involving all aspects of the city's zoning board of appeals, Concom, city council, et cetera, et cetera. You've all heard it. You've all read it. We've had a lot of social media surrounding this discussion. And these are efforts that are started years ago and has nothing to do with what the state's new law is. And so I view the work that our locale has done is taking responsibility for what our community needs are. Right. And so I can't remember how much time and money was spent on the housing production plan 4 years ago, but it was extensive. It wasn't from Puget Sound. It wasn't from Newport or Rhode Island or Portsmouth or any place else. It was directly related to Gloucester. And Carolyn Stewart wrote a very nice article in the paper, lifelong, members of the community aged out of their accommodations, ended up at Halyard, which is ironic. But that's exactly the people that we need to serve, our lifelong residents that need to do something that's different. We can't plan it. We don't know what family friendly is. Single mom with 2 kids, a single dad with 1 kid. It's not that granular, right? But the point of my comments is that we spent an enormous amount of time and effort trying to focus on Gloucester only. And if we focus on Gloucester only and I understand it and digest it, and these 9 very technical recommendations can go towards the solution of meeting a mandate, which is yet undefined from the state, then we need to do that hard work, right? This isn't 15 or 20 people saying this is a bad idea. There's 11,000 households, 28,000, 30,000 people that may benefit from these amendments and push us closer to complying with a mandate that we have no control over, right? And there's millions of dollars at risk over the next 10 years. So, you know, weigh the balances, right? I mean, you know, there's a lot of smart people in this town that are spending a lot of time on this effort, and they should be listened to, versus folks that parachute in at the last minute and say, I have a problem. So I'm just going to end it there. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Rick. I appreciate it. So my closing remarks are pretty simple. Let's keep our eyes on the part of this process that's in front of us right now. Right now, we have been asked before the end of the month to submit comments on the draft guidelines, and that is the step that we really need to focus on. So I asked members of the public that are on right now, there are 59 participants, which are 46 attendees, and there'll be folks that will be watching this tomorrow on Zoom, which is great. But I ask that you go back to that fact sheet that we have on the City Council website under zoning on the left side, and pull down this fact sheet and take a hard look at the guidelines. I've read it 2 more times today. In the past, I had read it once, and today I read it 2 more times. And the more I read it, the more thoughts that I have in terms of what I like about the guidelines and what I don't like about the guidelines. And councilors, we have an opportunity for council vote if we want to, as a group, make some suggestions when we come back on March 22nd. And we can do that as a group, or you can individually send your own if you have feedback on the guidelines. But that's where we are right now. And I think this informational session has been helpful. And it just kind of reminds us how many tough questions are still out there. This is a lot of stuff happening, coming at us, but I think many of our questions were answered. So let's take the time to really absorb all this factual information that we have. It's all there for us. Greg and you did a great job pulling this together in the fact sheet, and it gives us all that information that we need. So let's keep the eye on the prize right now to make sure that we're keeping this in perspective. This is step 1, and this was very helpful. So without further discussion, I would like to call the adjournment of the City Council by doing a roll call vote. Jeff Worthley,
Yes.
Scott Memard,
Yes.
Tony Gross.
Yes, do you need a motion first?
Oh, motion to adjourn. Thank you. Is there a second?
Second.
Thank you, Tony. My
Yes.
government guy.
Keeping us honest.
Okay. Jeff Worthley,
Yes.
Scott Memard,
Yes.
Tony Gross,
Yes.
Frank Majota,
Yes.
Tracy O'Neill,
Yes.
Jason Grow,
Yes.
Jamie O'Hara,
Yes.
and Val Gilman. We are formally adjourned. Rick Noonan, I'll let you close the meeting of the planning board, and thank you to the planning board for all your hard work.
Thanks to Greg.
Thank you very much.
Of course, to Greg, yes.
Thank you.
Accept the motion to adjourn the planning board. Beverly?
I'll second that.
Yeah, so move. Sorry.
So we have a motion and a second. Roll call vote, please.
Member Noonan,
Thank you. Yes.
Member Bookin,
Yes.
Member Henry.
Yes.
Good night.
Good night,
Adios,
everybody.
Sean.
Thank you, Greg.
Thank you.